Perfect. So many thanks for giving me the opportunity to present some thoughts on the question of measuring gender equality. Of course, as the vice rector mentioned it is important to quantify these inequalities or equalities to make them visible, but we should also think about how to have good quality measures. And so these are some thoughts I would like to share with you. And actually, I would like to make some comments or reflections on three elements. So first, I would like to go back also to the history a little bit, as mentioned by Pedro and others. There is a large tradition of inequality and equality analysis in sociology and social sciences. So we have good instruments, and so there is one I would particularly present to you, and then to make some kind of stock taking of existing gender inequality and equality indexes, and then to conclude with some thoughts on the quality criteria of these measures. So my first point would be the classical measure, and so I decided to present you the dissimilarity index, which is an index of gender segregation, not only of gender, but in general of segregation. But of course, it has been applied often to gender. And so this is a very early index in the 50s, developed by Duncan and Duncan. And with respect to the literature on gender equality, inequality, we distinguish between two elements of segregation. It's vertical gender segregation and horizontal gender segregation. Horizontal gender segregation means the differences between man and female in different professional fields. Vertical segregation concerns the differences of the proportions of females and males in different occupational positions, vertical positions, which means from top management to lower level of management, intermediate positions, and then at the end you have unskilled workers. So this is a very classical measure. It is, of course, it is a domain-specific measure. It concerns work. Work actually was one of the most important domains studied very early in sociology and inequality research. There are, of course, also more recent developments. There are always methodological problems with measures, and also Duncan and Duncan measure has some problems, but there is a refinement. In particular, I would like to mention the index of association, which was developed in the 90s and who is addressing some problems. So the nice element of the, let's say, this Duncan and Duncan index is that it is easy and simple to interpret, easy to understand, which is an important quality, I think, of measures. And so this measure tells you how many males or females you have to change from one field to another to have equal ratios. Let's say the proportion of females you have to put in the management level to have equal ratios between females and males in that management levels. And so this is a very nice indicator or index with respect to the meaning that is easy and clear. It can be also easily calculated on regional level, which would be an important element for our project. And so that's a kind of a classical example of gender inequality measures. Of course, this measure, as all measures, all indexes we have also already presented, and I will talk of others as well, they do not tell us what is behind this kind of inequalities, what are the mechanisms, the causes, possible causes of inequality or equality. And in respect to gender segregation, occupational gender segregation, there is a very rich literature which shows that we have mechanisms on all levels, individual level, interpersonal levels, organizational, institutional levels, but also societal levels, if we think at certain equality or equity values that are important for this problematic. So that's just a first example, and I want to share with you an analysis we did some years ago for the canton of Neuchâtel, which would be a kind of application on a regional basis. So the cantonal level in Switzerland would be, I think, NUTS-3 level in the European classification. I think it's important to have, if we are talking on regional indicators of equality, inequality, to have units which are also policy relevant. And of course, in Switzerland, it would be the canton, which is NUTS-3. Maybe in Italy, I think the regions are NUTS-2. In Germany, the Länder are NUTS-1. So these are important elements we should also think about. So in this analysis we did, we used the Swiss labor force survey, and we compared these segregation measures, vertical, horizontal segregation, gender segregations, with other types of segregation, nationality or migration background and age. So with respect of age, we just compared those below 40 and those over 40, those who have two age groups, which is also nice to compare gender to gender inequalities or to other types of ascriptive inequalities. Now, in sociology and in inequality research, ascriptive inequalities are an important element to be studied, but it's also important to know what is the importance of these gender inequalities with respect to other types of inequalities. So what you see on this slide are these 6 indicators, means for gender, nationality, and age. We calculated the horizontal and vertical gender segregation index. This is the index of association, which means that if you have the value of 1, you have equal ratios between females and males, or Swiss and non-Swiss, or young and older people in the professional fields, but also with respect to horizontal segregation, or on different hierarchical occupational positions with respect to the vertical segregation. So what is interesting and what comes very clearly here is that gender segregation is the most important element with respect to these ascriptive inequalities in the canton, and the vertical element of gender segregation, which is the solid line. Usually the solid line is the vertical segregation, the dotted line is the horizontal segregation. So the vertical segregation is even more important than the horizontal segregation. There is some kind of evolution in time with respect to nationality, the declining of segregation. We do also see some evolution with respect to the horizontal gender segregation, but the vertical gender segregation remains very stable on this level of 1.5, which means an over representation of males in top positions. So this just to show you a kind of application on regional level. And of course, this indicator, this classic indicator of segregation, is also included in the current multidimensional gender equality indexes, like the gender equality measure. in the field of work. Let me now go on to the more recent measures. This has also been mentioned by Enrico, so I will just briefly present them. So the one important measure or initiative for doing this kind of measures is the UNDP measure, which was presented in the 90s, the Gender-Related Development Index. And of course, this is in the context of the Human Development Index measures. So we have these 3 dimensions also, which are characterizing the human development measure: health, knowledge, standard of living. This is one important development in the 90s. And then we have other measures also mentioned by Enrico, like the Global Gender Gap Index developed by the World Economic Forum. So it's also interesting to have the measures I'm mentioning here are developed by associations, foundations, or civil society organizations, but also by representatives of international organizations, by academics or governmental organizations. So there are several propositions. We see in the case of the Global Gender Gap Index, we have 4 dimensions: economic participation, educational attainment, health, political empowerment, which is a broad concept of equality or inequality. In the case of the gender inequality index, we have the 6 dimensions. We already discussed of it. An interesting point, as Enrica presented it, it is already applied on the regional levels, so which is an interesting element. That's also the reason why we will focus on this index. There are other indexes which are maybe less broad, more focused on some domains, like the Women's Economic Opportunity Index, which has been proposed by the economists. Then we have the OECD Social Institution and Gender Index, which is more focused on discriminatory codes or legal aspects and civil liberties. I would also like to mention the Global Index on Legal Recognition of Homosexual Orientation, which also focus on legal elements, or the Sustainable Development Goal Gender Index. We just discussed this element of the Sustainable Development Goal. So there is also an index which is focusing on these elements, and I think which is proposed by the Equal Measure 2030 Association. And if I correctly remember, the last edition covers 13 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So these are new developments or current indexes that are proposed to measure gender equality. And what I want to do in my first step is to make some kind of reflection on what are the quality criteria for measuring this equality or inequalities. So I make reference here to, as I mentioned, there is a large academic tradition of measuring and conceptualizing inequalities. And so I will use a very nice article of Frederick Boysen, who evaluated 20 years ago indexes of development, or composite indexes of development, and we can use actually this framework. I added other criteria, but we can easily use this framework because also these current gender equality indexes have a very close link to the question of human development, as we saw it with the UNDP indexes. So this is a very nice framework. and to start with the most important element, which is the first criteria, which Boysen is speaking of is labeling content. So when Boysen is speaking content, then he means the theoretical and conceptual framework of the index. So it's important to have a clear theoretical conceptual framework, what has to be covered by the index. And if we apply this to our topic of equality, gender equality, and it is Pedro who told us on this element, it's important to make it clear of what we are talking. Is it equality, inequality, or is it equity and inequity? Is it disparity or dissimilarity as this kind of gender segregation index? And the other element, we should make it clear what is our concept of gender. Is it just female, male, or is it other things like sexual orientations and so on? And to show it to you, I found this very nice picture of differences. What is the difference between concept which is focusing on equality or on equity? So this, I think, these are important issues that has been to discussed in this kind of producing measures. Now, the second element of quality criteria is the technique and the method, which concerns the selection of the variables. And the most important message here that we should do a selection based on our theoretical concept. Of course, we have statistical also methods and instruments to do this kind of selections. But we should not use a kind of ad hoc selection, even if intuition sometimes is also an important element, but it should become a kind of explicit process of selection. The second element of the methodological criteria or quality criteria is more difficult, which concerns weighting and aggregation. So as we discussed, the new measures are very complex measures, multi-dimensional measures. So we have to define subdomains and the domains and then to put it to an overall index. How we do this, there are different ways to do that. We can use arithmetic means or geometric means. We can do an explicit or implicit weighting. Often these indexes have implicit weighting, which is maybe not the best way. There is often an equal weighting, implicit equal weighting. There are, of course, other options like expert-based weighting, or we could ask the population on subjective preferences. There is also there are statistical methods of weighting, but what is important that we might have different results using different ways of weightings. Then the question of aggregation is a difficult one, particularly if we have this kind of multidimensional indexes. And there might be also situations where the different parts or components are not fully comparable, that we can also only construct partial orders. If we have, for instance, ordinal scales. An important element here would be to test, to have robust measures to show how they are depending on different techniques of aggregations. Now, the last or the rest of the criteria you find on this last slide. So an important element in the discussion of these development indicators of Boysen was the comparative applications. Of course, we should have it across the space since we are interested in regions, and we have to discuss on what level of space. And it would be also important and interesting to have kind of informations on disparities within regions. And of course, we should have it across time. There is a fourth criteria, which I labeled the focus of measurement, which is a large discussion also in the literature. Should we use what type of measures we should use, or what type of indicators? Should we use input or output? There is a kind of one positions which would favor output, which this is what we are interested, the ends, but sometimes also inputs make sense. There are other types of indicators, of course, perceptions or indicators of access, which is an important element in the inequality discussion, access to resources, access to services. And we have this element of single versus multi-dimensional measures. We saw that the current indexes are multi-dimensional measures, so this is an important element to think about. There are also implications on the constructions of these multi-dimensional measures. The fifth criteria is clarity and simplicity, and so what we want is a simple measure that has a clear meaning, and it should be attractive also for communication purposes. The sixth criteria is the availability across time. We should have this data available over time and space. This is an important element of the project. The data should be flexible for future adaptation. It should be there should be a legitimacy of the data and the concept in the sense of a public acceptance, and the measures should be policy relevant. So these are the criteria, quality criteria we should apply to these measures of gender equality. Let me conclude some concluding remarks. So we see that at the national level, we have several gender equality measures and indexes. There is, what is interesting, only recently applications at the regional level in Europe. In other regions, for instance, in the US, we have already in the 80s analysis or very broad indexes of gender equality. So this is an element which we already mentioned. There is also a rich experience of scientific knowledge on conceptualizing and measuring these kind of inequalities and equalities. There seems to be a trend to more complex measures of inequality and equality. And of course, as also mentioned by Pedro, equality are complex phenomena, and so we want to have also complex measures or multidimensional measures to have a good base, conceptual base for these indicators. The 9 quality criteria I presented for constructing these indexes may be easily applied to this regional level, but there are also some conflicting objectives. So there could be a conflict between simplicity and attractivity and the multidimensionality. There should also be could be some conflicts between policy relevance and multidimensionality. And there are challenges we have to deal with, like weighting and aggregation issues, in particular, if we have multidimensional indexes in order to have robust measures. So this here I will stop. Many thanks.